This is my buddy Rob Cook. It was an absolute pleasure to sit with him and discuss a few aspects of his life.
I was born in 1950 in Smith Memorial Hospital, and I mention the hospital because it's an important part of Alma, the town of 10,000. Almost everybody my age was born there and in the county, and it was a big stone mansion built by Am I Right, who was one of the city's forefathers. He built it in about 1895. Magnificent structure with a matching stone carriage house behind it, which has been torn down since. And currently, as we speak, there's a reconstruction. It stood empty and crumbling, and after it was a hospital, it was doctor's offices and counseling facilities, all kinds of other things. But then it sat dormant for years and was crumbling and falling apart. And so many people felt so strongly about it that they formed a community group, and it's going to become a historical museum. And for 20 years, I lived uh, about 300 yards away in a wonderful turn of the century Tudor that was built by one of Am I Right's contemporaries, William Balke. And it was the library when I was a little kid. I used to go to Story Hour there, and I couldn't believe it when it became available for sale. So I loved living there. But and then so whenever I gave house tours, people often wanted to go through the house. I could stand in the front porch at the beginning and say I was born right over there, and I went to grade school right over there across the park. That building's still there. But so I'm an Alma guy. I've lived there all my life. We moved to East Lansing to downsize and be closer to my wife's relatives in East Lansing, but I still have a lot of roots. The Rebeats Tower is still in Alma, and I have some rental properties there, so I'm up there several times a week, and uh, basically an Alma guy. And so many drummers, when they talk about getting started, it becomes evident they were just meant to do it. They pushed me towards other instruments in elementary school band. They wanted me to play trumpet, and I did. I played trombone for a summer band, and all the time I kept saying drums because at home I'd been playing these cherry cans and stuff like that. Buy cherries in 5-gallon cans, and those were wonderful drums when the cherries were gone, and of course oatmeal boxes, anything that resembled a drum. It, born drummers gravitate to. And they finally listened to me in about third grade because I kept saying drums, and they said, "No, we've we've got a drummer. We have only one drum, and if you insist, okay, but you're going to have to play this wastebasket turned upside down on a chair." And that was fine. I mean, it was every bit as good as a cherry can or something. And I was with a group of musicians playing drums. So that was great. And it just went from there. They kept giving me things at Christmas then. I ended up, the first kit I think was a Zildjian Ludwig bass drum. And I had no clue what that meant. I knew I was halfway there because it had the word Ludwig on it. I thought maybe Leedy meant it was a budget one, or had no clue, but I always kind of wondered about it. And decades later, before I'd find out. But and then just before that, a Gretsch marching drum, student marching drum. So that was my snare drum, and then the Leedy and Ludwig bass drum, and then just go from there until I was able to get real drums in high school. A lot of credit goes to John Aldridge and Steve Shelley. Steve Shelley started coming to the shop in Alma. By the time I met him, I'd been in business for a few years, and was starting to build up a bit of a music store. It started as a Christian bookstore, and they sold Decca um, phonographs and all kinds of sticks and reeds and accessories mainly, and maybe a few K guitars. But when I bought that business, I expanded the music department into basically a separate store, Cook's Music. and specialized in drums. And word got around, and a lot of my customers were coming from Lansing and Saginaw and Midland towns, larger towns, 40 to 50 miles away. And every year, Steve Shelley, this quiet kid, maybe 13, no, more like 10, come over at Christmas time with his mom, and she would kind of shepherd him around and encourage him. And he was so quiet. He was reluctant to speak out, but he'd come over for a cymbal, and she'd be prodding him and, well, tell him what you want, Steve, and everything. And just the nicest family. And he kept coming back year after year as he went through high school. And then I lost touch with him. And then the story that he was embarking on, I didn't learn till later, but he graduated high school and greatly disappointed his parents in not going to college. They really were pushing for that, but he was a born drummer. And the only gig he could find being a professional drummer was with a touring polka band in Michigan, this old guy, and he was loving that. And then again, he dropped off my radar. And a few years later, his mom came in to get him a Christmas present. And I was helping her pick something out. And that was the first time she'd ever come in by herself without Steve. So, of course, I was asking her about what Steve was up to. And she said, well, he's in New York. He's been there a couple of years. And then it turns out he went there and got into steel drums. So he's going to all these clubs that had steel drums. He was just obsessed with those. And then into punk. And he became the original drummer for, I think he was the original drummer. I guess I'd have to check that. But he was the drummer for many years for Sonic Youth. And all of a sudden he was on magazine covers, and they just had spectacular success. They signed with Geffen, and they brought Nirvana to Geffen, and David Geffen was so grateful that they worked out an informal deal where Sonic Youth was welcome to bring artists to Geffen, and most of the people they brought and recommended got signed. So Steve was back visiting and came over to see me, and we were. I can almost remember the year, which is unusual because it was 40 years ago. But in about 83, there was an oil embargo, which is kind of weird to mention that since it's going on now. But the oil embargo then was when we went from gas stations on every four corners, all four corners a lot of times, to just shells of gas. So many deserted gas stations now. And it affected everything made with petroleum, and not the least of which was, drum coverings and drum skins. And combine that with the export invasion of Pearl and the other imported brands that were decimating the American drum industry, with Ludwig selling out in 81. And if you look through all the stories, it was the early 80s when Gretsch, Rogers, Slinger, everybody was having trouble.
Yeah.
And I had been selling practically a drum kit a week, at least half a dozen every 6 weeks, I'm sure. And it went to a fraction of that. Drum sales just plummeted. I didn't have Pearl. There was another dealer about 30 miles away that was selling them like gangbusters. And I was still selling Ludwig, Rogers, Slingerland. And I took on a lot of trades. And I didn't know anything about most of the drums that were being traded in, except they were old. And I didn't want to throw them away. And the customer wanted something for them. So usually I'd say, 25 bucks for that old kit, or 50 bucks or something. And I had shelves of these old drums because they'd been building up for a number of years before Steve came in. And I was showing Steve around the shop. And when we got to that room, he lit up and said, oh man, hey, you've got, and he was pointing stuff out. And he said, you know what you need to do? There's this guy named John Aldridge that's putting out a newsletter. And you've got to get a hold of him, because a lot of us are getting into this and learning more about these old drums. And that's exactly what John's trying to help us do. So I get a hold of John, and he was putting out Not So Modern Drummer as like a 5-page mimeograph sheets stapled together. And basically, members, it was like kind of like a club. I don't know if he even charged a subscription fee. He probably did, knowing John. Probably $5 or something. But anyhow, there'd be the postings in every issue from the usual suspects, Mike Lorenz in Milwaukee, and oh God, whose names am I? I'm going to leave out names if I start trying to name them. But I learned an awful lot from John, and ended up going out to see him and met him for the first time when he was living in Boulder, and went to a little studio with him, and we did a sit down, and he told me about black beauties and stuff. We did a segment for a video. As I was trying to learn, it occurred to me that there's a lot of other people in my position and that were looking for the information and to figure out what they had and what they wanted. And the being the capitalist, I thought, well, I'll make a video, and I'll teach people, and I'll sell it, and I'll learn a lot as I'm making the video, because I'll interview people that know a lot more than me, and I'll help other people learn too. So I made the video and went on from there.
That is a fascinating story. So when he came in the store, was he in Sonic Youth at the time?
When he came in the time with
When he saw all the
the
drums?
drums, yeah, yeah.
That is
Yeah,
fascinating.
very quiet and unassuming. I tried to get him to shows a few times, but he declined. Yeah, that's not really my, he didn't want to sit and sign autographs and meet
Yeah.
people who would like the band and that kind of thing. Uh, but he was real gracious with comps and stuff. I'll never forget one time he fixed us up with comps for a show that they were doing in the Detroit area in a hall or arena, actually. And they were playing with Social Distortion and Neil Young. And a lot of the people in the audience had come to see Neil Young and Social Distortion and Sonic Youth. It was I felt so bad for the family. I was sitting with Steve's mom and dad, and they were people catcalling and stuff because they were waiting for Neil Young, and they were booing and so, yeah, that wasn't really their kind of thing. They enjoyed the tour, and Neil was pretty nice to them. They didn't really, I don't know if they'd even met him yet when I talked to him, because they were like in a van or something, and not on the bus and all that. I stand a pretty good chance of crediting Maury LeSean from Frank's Drum Shop. I I got my first drum set there in '66, and uh, my dad took me up there. We were in town on a office supply convention, and my dad saw the listing, Frank's Drum Shop, as we were walking down Wabash, and he wanted to take me up. And not that he was a drum guy, but he knew I was. And I thought, looks like an office. It's going to be a dusty old office up there. Nah, let's go down to, there wasn't a Grinnell's. I forget the names of the music stores. But he talked me into doing it. And we went up in the elevator, and the elevator doors open, and it's just a wonderland. One kid, Maury, used to say, swallowed his gum when the elevator doors opened. But it was just the famous Frank's Drum Shop. And boom, my dad was a people person. He was real outgoing. Who was the guy that did the seminars on getting along with people and stuff? That'll come to me. I'm blanking out on it. But anyhow, and he was a Mason, and just a good-hearted guy. And he met Maury, the owner, in short order, and introduced me. And Maury put his arm around me and gave me a tour of the place, and ended up selling us a drum set. And not that he was a salesman or pushed. In fact, he refused sales at times. Somebody rich would come in with their little kid and want to buy him an octopus, and he wanted him to start on a snare drum and stuff, and he would just guide him. He never pushed anybody. But that was the beginning of a great friendship. And I got home, and I would call Frank's. I was in, well, I would have been 66, 16, not what, ninth grade. And I had friends, of course, that were buying drum stuff. And I would call Maury and say, "What? Can you send me a 20-inch Zildjian?" And he'd give me 40% off. He gave most everybody 40% off. It was kind of a stock thing. He gave good deals, but I could get it shipped to me in Michigan and sell it to my friend for 20% off and make a couple bucks. So, and he always took my calls. I felt really important. I could call Frank's Drum Shop and ask for Maury, and he'd ask me how the weather was in Michigan and everything. And I went to clinics there then later and stayed in touch with him. And a lot more stories with Frank's and Maury. But uh, when he retired and was in Florida, he called me in, I think it was about a March of the year. I don't remember which year it was, but he told me he wanted to do a memoir and have it published. And oh, I had written a history of Frank's for Modern Drummer. That's why, partly why he called me. Probably mostly why he called me, but he knew who I was. And when he saw my name on the article, he called and said he wanted to do a memoir and he wanted me to do it. And he wanted it out by PASIC that fall. I think he was one of the founding members of PASIC, actually. If he wasn't, several of his associates there were Roy Knapp and people like that. And of course, Bill Ludwig Sr. Um, so I immediately flew to Florida and took a tape recorder, and we sat, and they just told me their life stories and all kinds of associated stories, and showed me their pictures, and I took pictures of their pictures, and then he loaned me a few to take along. And I took all that stuff and transcribed the tapes and sent him a transcript or a manuscript. And we went back and forth a couple times. And I had a friend that I'd been friends with since high school. All of this was happening in, I was already in business. I had the bookstore and music store and so on. But a friend from my school days, who was a drummer in a nearby town, had gone into a career in printing, and he had kind of a backyard printing operation, a couple of A.B. Dick 360s, chain drive printing presses. They were always breaking down and stuff, but he printed it for me. And that project he did on schedule and as quoted and everything. And looking at it now, it's real primitive. I mean, there weren't really computers to speak of. There were a few Amigas and the very beginnings of computers, and I think I used PageStream software, but it's pretty crude. It's got the real this old house feel to it. But we got it out, and he introduced it at PASIC that fall. And one of the wonderful things about that whole project was he wanted to have a section of some of his closest friends and associates over the years, and he wanted a page for each guy, and he wanted me to contact them and get a current picture. And Maury had most of the old pictures, but if he didn't have one, I was to try to get a picture from back in the day when they were close to Maury and doing a lot of business with him, and an inset picture of today and a little comment. And he gave me the contact information for everybody, and it just took my breath away. I mean, it was Vic Firth and Carmine Apiece and Roy Burns and Ed Shaughnessy and oh God, I'm leaving a lot of people out, but just on and on and on. And anybody that I contacted, when I told them what I was doing and who it was for, they were like, "Oh, he was like a dad to me." Of course. And they gave me really nice quotes, and all of a sudden I was their friend. I'd run into them at NAMM or something, and I could walk up to Armand or Robert Zildjian or Remo Belli he was from Mishawaka, and they just loved telling old stories and stuff. And it was like a old home discussion or something. Although I was a kid and I was just overwhelmed. And I don't remember what led to the actual drum books, but after the first one, which that same printer did, and had to bring me boxes of pages that I had to collate, and they weren't in order. And there's a whole raft of stories about that.
Mm.
In fact, the story of that first edition, I have a page for it, slingerlanddrum.com. That takes you to a page on the Rebeats site that gives the history of the Slingerland book and the different editions and
Was
stuff.
Slingerland the first one?
Yeah, yeah. And then I pretty much use, after I was done with that, geez, I should have done Ludwig, and because I'm basically a Ludwig guy more so than any of the other drum companies. And that kit that I had bought was a Ludwig Hollywood in Oyster Blue that I have again now. I had sold it for, and it came back to me after a few years. But I just used the same outline or same MO on each book. I'd start with a company history and background, maybe a family history of the company, of the family that started the company, and then a little bit of a business history, and then an endorser section, and then a dating guide as best as I could put together. And yeah, one just led to the next.
Was there a reason why Slingerland was first?
I was talking to Joe Partridge last night about this, and that kind of puzzled me. That thought occurred to me. I thought, why didn't I do Ludwig first? And no, I don't remember.
Interesting.
I got a call from a guy in Mishawaka, Remo's hometown, and Remo was a really nice guy. He was always really kind to me. But this guy had a drum set for sale, George Way drum set, and I went down and I bought it from him, and he had some George Way marching. He was a George Way fan, and I think he had been to the shop. But anyhow, he showed me some pencils and stuff, and he said, all of George Way's stuff ended up over in Elkhart at Bob Kane's place. And Bob Kane had been a vice president at Selmer in the Ludwig days in the 80s. And he gave me his name and contact info. And what had happened was when George died and his widow Elsie was in really bad health and practically blind, she moved back to Canada, to Edmonton, where she was from. George had met her in Edmonton when he was there. And the business that they were running at that time was called GHW, Drummers Supplies. And this Christian bookstore that I had bought, when they were giving me the teaching me the ropes of what to order from where, they had a GHW catalog, and they said, now there's a wonderful old man here. His name is Frank Reed, and you buy all of your cymbals from him because he's just a really good guy, and he'll give you good prices and everything. Zildjian has had different distribution methods over the years. Sometimes you buy from a distributor, or sometimes the distributor. They've had only one at times. Other times they've gone direct, etc. But at that time, there were numerous, all the big, Grossman, Wexler, all the distributors sold Zildjian, but they said go to GHW. And I had done business with GHW for a number of years before it occurred to me to ask Frank what the GHW even stood for. But he had told me about George Way. And Frank had been I think, a clarinetist or something. He played some other instrument, but he was a real close friend of George's and started working for him part-time in his retirement. So he took the business. He ran the business when Elsie moved back to Canada, and then eventually bought it from her or from the estate. So Frank Reed, and there's a little bit more to this. I think there was somebody else. I don't think Bob Kane got it directly from Frank, but by the time Bob Kane acquired the name and business, there wasn't much inventory left, and it was his intention to sell, as I recall, band accessories, pads, and for clarinets, and all kinds of musical accessories in his retirement. And when he bought the business, there wasn't much inventory, but he got a bunch of other stuff, and that included all of George Way's archives, his I mean, everything from his birth certificate. Do I have his birth certificate? I think so. But I know I have his adoption papers where his family uh, actually adopted him. And through his burial papers, the receipt for his funeral and flowers and everything, all kinds of health records and hospital records. And it was basically probably two 4-drawer filing cabinets full of stuff. Catalogs, I still have a lot of the catalogs. And Eddie Knight told me once he used to go in and see George towards the end of George's career, and he'd be all excited about some new drum accessory or invention. And George would look at him and say, "Oh, bebop, that's been done." And he'd turn around and flip through his catalogs and pull out something from the 20s and say, "See, this is when you did it first." And blah, blah, blah. But uh, so I asked if I could borrow some catalogs because by this time I was starting to do some of the books and stuff. And I thought, oh man, this is a treasure trove of information. There was files of correspondence that George had with different people, and Elsie had graduated from a business college and kind of was George's lifelong secretary in addition to wife. And often in correspondence, when George would get a letter, which was usually typed, she would type a return with a carbon set so that they could keep a copy of his return and staple that to the original. So there's files where he's going back and forth with like Clarence White, a retired timpanist, and they would talk about their early days and stuff, and you could read the letters back and forth one after the other. Just great stuff.
Wow.
And all the Leedy sales records from years and 8x10 pictures of everything under the sun. And I wanted access to that, obviously. And Bob was kind of reluctant. He said, "Nah, I can't really let this stuff go." And he said, "Maybe I'll think about it. You can go through this stuff." And I made a couple trips down. It was about a 3-hour drive, but I would go down and kind of paw through the stuff and talk to him about things. He wasn't a very nice man. He was kind of gruff, and he didn't have a good reputation. When you talk to people that worked with him, he was kind of a jerk. But he didn't want anything to go. But finally, he said, why don't you just, I'll give you all of it. Why don't you just buy it?" And I said, "Okay, but how much do you want?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. What do you give me?" And I said, "Well, I'm really at your mercy. It could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. It could be worth $50. I don't really know. But I do know that I can't afford that much. I could afford to pay you like $100 a month for a year at $1,200." And he doubled it. He said, "Well, I'd do it for $2,400 at $200 a month." And I thought, what a jerk. He just trying to squeeze me here. But I thought, yeah, okay. And I agreed to that and paid him the first 200 and got it all into my Ford Fairlane. I can't remember what I was driving, maybe a van. Anyhow, I took it all home, and I'll never forget. My son was maybe 6 at the time, and I started bringing in some of the boxes. And on the kitchen, we started opening boxes. And I had already done the drum badge timeline, so my son knew what that was. And he had seen the actual, that was before the days of computers, so I had made it. It was full size with using real badges and photographs of badges, and I had that under plexiglass. So he knew what badges were. And one of the things I found was a little canvas bag, and I dumped it out, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, of badges, all kinds of, mainly Leedy and old the white oval Ludwigs and stuff. And my son lit up and said, "Oh man!" And he started asking me about this stuff, and I told him that I had bought it, and I was about to say, "But don't say anything." and my wife came to the kitchen door and was standing there, and he turns to her and says, "Look what Dad bought." And it wasn't exactly hand to mouth, but we didn't have the money for that kind of stuff, and she thought I just was throwing money out the window, and she started crying. It was not good, but it worked out. I mean, geez, just that bag of badges was worth more than $2,400 in later years. But,
Wow.
but then the more I dug through that stuff and saw what George had done, then that led to me putting out George Way's Little Black Book, because I wanted to find out more about George. And this Little Black Book was a little ring binder that he had that pocket size, and it was a vendor directory. He told where he bought cork and some procedures on how to lacquer drums and all this stuff. And I thought, well, this is great. I bet some of these guys, drum builders and guys into vintage drums, would like this. And if I put in a little bio, 5-10 pages bio at the beginning, it'll probably pry some things loose. I'll start hearing from people, and that worked. That was one of my very first books too, George Way's Little Black Book, with a little mini bio at the beginning.
Is that book still available?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I think I probably got it at the drum show. I'm pretty sure I have them at the Reeves
Pick
booth.
one of those up.
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff that you got went into what became the Leedy Way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to. That was my goal from when I put out the Little Black Book, to ultimately do a biography. And at one point, my grand plan was to do a 3-volume thing, one with his life story, one with all of those old catalogs, and what was the third? It was related. And I went to Scarecrow Press in Canada. They specialize in books for libraries and stuff like that. And they agreed to publish it. But I went to the National Endowment for the Arts, or Humanities, DEH, can't remember the name of the organization, tried to get a grant to support me for a couple of years while I did that. And they said it was too limited a niche. My grant request got turned down. So I just kept working on it a little bit here and there, and ultimately it became the Leedy Way. Yeah.
Do you commonly work on multiple books at a time, or do you focus
Yeah.
on one? And
Well, yeah, that I started on the Leedy Way. It didn't have that name yet, but I knew it was going to be a George Way biography. But there was no internet, and we were using the phones where you pick up and dial and stuff, and a lot of the correspondence was typewritten. And so when it came to getting information on his early drum companies in Canada and stuff like that, I was writing to provincial offices in Canada, and getting information on when the corporation was dissolved that he had formed in Canada, and stuff like that takes a lot of time. And then interviewing and people like Bob and Armand and Remo, and getting stories from all of them about George, and then transcribing them. So that was a really slow process that took many years, and I was doing the other books in the meantime. Yeah. I was a sound contractor. I specialized in my music store as it grew. Eventually, it became 3 music stores, but mainly 2. I only had the third one in Midland for a few months. That didn't work out. But I had Cook's Music in Mount Pleasant and Alma, and did a lot of sound installations. I'm an analog audio guy by background, and I've been interested in PA stuff since I was in high school, using a little Bogan PA and some homemade columns for our bands and stuff. So I was a self-taught audio guy that did pretty well with audio. I ended up installing sound systems in churches across Michigan and schools, but mainly churches, hundreds of them. And it came to the attention of a bigger audio contractor in Saginaw called Simone Systems, they had hired a former manager of Cook's Music after I sold Cook's Music. He was kind of displaced. The new owner didn't want to keep him on, so he went to work for Simone. And Simone had designed and installed the sound system at the Silver Dome and at the U of M Stadium and some other facilities. So Steve was working for them, and they were, since they had done the Silver Dome sound system, they were operating it on game days. And Steve was a technician for them, and put me in contact with the owner, and they hired me also as a assistant. My and from the first game I worked in '97, I was always assigned to the visiting coaches. And in those days, the coach intercoms were all hardwired, and it was 6 or 8 guys with 100-foot cables, and there were only 2 channels, offense and defense, and the head coach could talk to either. So he had a 6-pin, everybody else was 3-pin, being on one channel. And it was my job to talk to the team as soon as they got there and figure out how many headsets they needed and single or double muff and get them wired and happy. So, and I've been on the visitors sidelines for the Lions ever since. The equipment obviously evolved. We were hardwired for about 3 years, and I think we first went wireless around 2000. And we're in about our 4th generation of wireless now. And as everything got more sophisticated, they put in more and more. It took more and more training. I mean, it's pretty high-tech stuff now. And eventually they gave us a name. They put hats on everybody, and we were the first 2 years. First 1 year it was a hot pink hat, and that was so that the coaches would know who to yell at and who to go to if they were having an issue. And the second year they went to yellow, and it's been yellow ever since. So I'm a yellow hat, and each team has basically 3 yellow hats. They can have a few additional assistants, but there's a guy on each sideline and a guy up in the booth. So I've been a visitor's yellow hat for the Lions since then.
Yeah, I mean, it must be great to be the visitor sideline because you get a different coaching staff every week.
Exactly. Yeah. People always say, "Oh, do you travel?" And I think that'd be the worst thing for me. I mean, all that time just sitting in airports and sitting on buses and chewing up a whole weekend for a 3-hour event. But yeah, I have to be there at 5 hours before kick to get the tech cart set up, which is something that developed over the years. And along the way, the league put more and more restrictions on the position. They declared that yellow hats could have no responsibilities on the field other than being a yellow hat. So eventually I parted ways with Simone and just built the Lions directly as a contractor. The equipment manager for the Lions, Tim O'Neill, has been just really nice to me, and it was at his suggestion that I do that. And my pay tripled at that point. He thought I was getting paid way too little, and told me to check around with some of the other yellow hats, find out what the going rate was. And when I came back and told him, he talked me up $200 from that for my day rate, and just been great to me. But I forgot what the question was now, and I lost my train of thought.
We were just talking about how great the sideline.
That's the thing.
Do you deal directly with head coaches or any of the coaches?
Yes and no. Now that there's 3 at each stadium for the home team, the visiting team travels with 1, and it's my job to work with that yellow hat. And the nice thing about that, the first few years of being a yellow hat, I had to deal directly with the coaches, and the head coach never bothered with that. He was expecting to be handed a headset that worked, and so it'd be an assistant or something. And eventually it changed to the team having to travel with the yellow hat because they've got a lot of programming. Each belt pack now is like a mini computer, and I can take any belt pack from a coach and reprogram it to be a different coach, because you burn the the data to all of the belt packs at once, and then you go through to each one and assign a name to it, and so on. So there's a lot of prep work that has to be done by a traveling yellow hat. So as soon as the visiting yellow hat gets there, it's my job to keep him happy. The tech cart is my first thing to get going because it's the nerve center of all communications and everything. It's this massive cart that is attached with 2 fiber cables and a big power line because it's got its own UPCs and stuff. And it's where the injury review and the coach to quarterback systems are headquartered. And of course, this is all networked. And being an analog audio guy, most yellow hats used to be analog audio guys, but most now are systems guys. They're familiar with, I don't want to say internet, but everything is tied together. What do you call them? I can't even think what they're called. They're kind of like the switches. Everything is with those like phone connectors and stuff, and that no XLRs anymore. But basically, I have to get the system going. There's a laptop in there that the visiting team loads their setup so he can see visually on the screen what's happening in terms of battery life and who's talking and if there's a problem. And of course, he has a belt pack that he can switch to any coach and listen. So when there's a complaint, he can verify it and we go from there. And then if the complaint involves something on our end as far as the stadium equipment, then I can radio or call the upstairs yellow hat or the frequency coordinator or whoever needs to address the problem.
Your sideline? You're down on the field?
Yeah.
Has there been any coaches, particularly over the year, that were particularly ornery or nice even?
A lot of really nice ones. One of the first games I worked, it was before they had colored hats, and Kenny Anderson, the Hall of Fame quarterback from Cincinnati, we had Cincinnati in, and I was afraid I was going to lose my job because I learned never to ask for an autograph or anything like that after that, but I had already asked Kenny Anderson when I found out who it was to sign my little, that's a no-no, you don't do that. But I had already done it, and he didn't look annoyed or anything. He seemed real nice, and he was the offensive coordinator and the equipment guy. They didn't have that split up yet, and so but he was the guy that told me how many coaches needed what and so on. So we get it going, and they were down at halftime and in a pissy mood. The coaches were all pretty uptight and angry anyhow. And I had been told, look, at halftime, you're going to end up with a bundle like this, about this long, and some 10-foot cables, because those 100-foot cables get braided up as they're pacing and everything. And not everybody had a cable page. Practically nobody had a cable page following them around to keep them straight. So they said, just stay calm and get as many as you can straightened out and leave it. Don't panic, work quickly. And I did that, and I got maybe 50 feet free for each of the coaches, and there was still a big clump. And one of the coaches jumped all over me. He came out and he pointed at that and he said, what the fuck you been doing? You had all the halftime. There's no excuse for that, and just chewing me out. And I thought, oh God, this is about my third game, and I thought, oh, this isn't good. So I radioed Mark Simone upstairs to ask him if I should keep on working at it, try to stay out from underfoot, but trying to keep it straight, or just to leave it. And he was kind of curt. He had a lot going on. He didn't want to hear from me. And he said, well, that's a question for the equipment manager. And I radioed him back and said, well, that's Mr. Anderson. And he didn't answer me. So then okay, now what do? Do I not do what my boss told me to do? Or I went up. They were in the middle of a drive. He's the offensive coordinator, and he's standing on the sideline. And I tap him on the shoulder, and he looks around. And I said, "Mr. Anderson, your coach is upset. Do you want me to keep working on that?" And he looked at it, and it was like he didn't even hear it. He just went back. And I thought, I just went back with my tail between my legs and hoped it didn't explode. And it didn't get any worse from there. But here's the kid that had already asked him for an autograph, tapping him on the shoulder during the drive. Oh no!
It's income.
But and a lot of coaches obviously get upset, and you don't take it personally because their lives are on the line, their careers on one play. But John Shoup, the offensive coordinator for the Bears, was the absolute worst. The Simone crew was threatening to get me T-shirts that said "I'm Shoup's bitch," because he would come out. By the time we had a couple of run-ins, because we played the Bears twice a season, and they're in Detroit every season, and he'd come out onto the field just looking at me like, "Oh, there's that guy. I'm gonna," just glaring at me and an asshole. And he would blow up. Everybody knew he was a hothead, and in those days I would audit all of the conversation because it was easy to do. These days you've got to have one of those belt packs and know what to pick to listen to, and I'm not forbidden from listening to those, but unless I'm invited by the visiting yellow hat to listen to something, I don't. But I was listening to everything, and something would be going wrong on the field, and Shoup would blow up, and he'd be cussing out some player and say, "Yeah, you got to get that motherfucker out of there. He's got his head up his ass, and there's no excuse." And the other coaches would be, John, calm down. Hey, trying to talk him down and everything. But yeah, he was the absolute worst. He always comes to mind. Yeah, no clue. Um, Fortunately, I did 15 years at a casino where the production manager, it's only 15 miles from my home, and it's a 3,000 seat room, and the production manager there used to work for me. He bought his first guitar from me. So when he became production manager there, he asked me if I wanted to do some stagehand work, and then when they started having video, he told me if I could work every show, he'd make me the video director. So I became the video director for 15 years, and I learned production methods, the load in, the setup, the operation, the loadout, and a lot of that was just ingrained in me and kind of transferred into a vision for what the show wanted to do. But at one point, I think the 20th show, I had like 3 interlinked PA systems, and then separate little systems for the second stage, the cafe and the master classroom. Video all over the place, doing a 4-camera shoot on the clinic stage, and a little switcher, but way overdone. Didn't need to be done. Maybe shouldn't have, but I was having so much fun doing it and planning the details that I didn't have enough staff to really operate all that stuff correctly. But I'm jumping ahead back to the start of it. I don't know how I heard about it, but there was a get together, a swap meet, and I think it's what we still called the first show, but it was actually right around here, near Bunny's place in Loves Park, and I knew Bunny from those days, and had been to his house to look at his drums and stuff. But there was a drum shop in the area called Drum Barn, I believe. Jack Hutchinson was the guy that ran it, and he's the one that organized the get together. And it was in the lower section of a Holiday Inn or something in Loves Park, the town that Bunny lives in. And there were maybe 10 of us. I know Jack Brand from Percussion Express was there, and I'm going to start leaving people out if I try to name them all. But it was basically a swap meet. There are boxes of parts. A few people brought kits. I was showing Bunny my plan for the drum badge timeline, and he went home and got a rare William F. Ludwig badge and on a drum and brought it to show me and let me take pictures of it, and was a big help. And the next year, I had such a good time with that that I called Jack to get the date on the next show, and it was about 3 months ahead of when it would have been if it was the same time, which was this time of year. And he said, "Oh no, I'd lost money on that. I'm not going to do it. I lost money, not interested. But hey, if you want to do it, I'll give you all the contact information for the people that came and stuff." So we had the second show in my shop in Alma, Michigan, and it was about the same size. John Orlick introduced his glass drums at that show. That was the big splash. And Joe Chilla was there, and Terry Brees. No, Terry didn't come. Um, it's embarrassing. The Skins and Tins. Can't believe I'm forgetting his name because he's one of the oldest exhibitors. It'll come to me in a second, and I'll blurt it out and be embarrassed I left it out. Trying too hard to think of it. But anyhow, he's the only exhibitor that's been at every show, including the one in Alma.
So what year would this be?
92, I think. Yeah, I think the first one was 91, and the one in Alma was 92. Liz and Terry. Terry, now I'm only missing the last name. That's bugging me. Anyhow, Liz and Terry came up, and they had a son, Ian, just about the same age as my son, Will, who would have been about 7 then. They had a good time playing, and we knew him ever since. But then it occurred to me that if I was going to keep doing it, it was going to stay that size. But if I could get to Lansing or a bigger town, and I thought, well, probably back in Chicago. So the third show, I had a couple of partners, and I can't remember how I came into contact with them, but one was with Robert Carone, who is probably still the owner of Upstaging. Have you ever heard of them? They're like a trucking and production and staging company. Originally, I think he played in a band with his brother, and they had a huge PA and lighting rig for the size of the band. And the equipment made more money than they did. Somebody in Iowa or someplace called one time when a big band was coming through that had an equipment problem, and they did the sound and lights, and then realized they really needed to do that, and that really took off. I mean, Upstaging. I sent Robert a list from a sound contracting trade magazine that had a list of all the tours and where they were playing and what kind of rig they were using and stuff. And it was like 200 listings. And I sent it to Robert and said, "Hey, put a highlighter to the shows that Upstaging is doing." And they did some staging. Robert's brother did lights. They didn't do audio, but they did the transport. And he had hundreds of semis. And that page came back about 2/3 yellow. They were doing everybody. Upstaging, which was huge. I didn't learn that till later. It just seemed like a normal, and he was a Rogers guy. He was a Rogers fan.
Yeah.
And I had sent him some Rogers parts, and didn't even charge him. I remember some hi-hat extension rods or something that he needed, and I'd send them to him. No charge. And if I had any idea of his ability to pay. Anyhow, he was one of my partners, and then a Mark Petrowski, a Polish guy who lived in Chicago, and his business was buying used instruments and exporting them to Poland and reselling over there. So it was a three-way partnership, and it was at the Holiday Inn on Wolf Road, Hillside, Illinois. And then that one started getting bigger. I mean, we had probably 30 or 40 exhibitors there, and it started to take off. And that didn't work out so well because any major decision I felt should be a three-way decision. So any major decision that came up, I was in contact with both of them and getting their feedback and so on. And it was a little convoluted. And when it came time to settle up, Robert had done the accounting, and we were, we split all the expenses and we were going to split all the profits, and there weren't any profits. He said, yeah, we didn't really make anything because we had so many expenses. And I thought, well, maybe that's because you had a crew of 8 that were family members and they all got paid and stayed in the hotel and everything. So I was a little aggravated about that, but I thought it is what it is. It was still a lot of fun and it seemed to be growing, so we'll do it again. And about 6 months later, I started trying to contact them about the next show, and I got kind of waffly answers. It sounded like they weren't really interested, so I started planning it by myself and worked out a deal with. I was contacted out of the blue by Carl Dustman, who at the time was helping develop the DePaul Music Mart. The old Goldblatt's department store, multi-story building, had been bought by DePaul University, and they were putting their music department in it. And their plan was to have performance spaces and a lot of retail on the ground level and below. And Carl was consulting with them, and I'd known Carl for quite a while, interviewed him for the Ludwig book and stuff. And Carl had heard about the show, and he contacted me to see if I wanted to do the show at this music mart for free. He'd give me the facility. I thought, great, it's downtown. Mom and Dad can come, and Mom can go shopping. Dad go to the show, and that'll be great. It was a nightmare. Great facility, but driving in the loop and trying to get down an alley to load in a freight elevator with all these, that didn't really work. But I said yeah, and we worked out a date and stuff. And then I get a call from Mark Petrosky, and he said that he and Robert have decided to go ahead and do the show, as a duo. And I said, oh, first thing I thought, well, I that's okay. I'm going to do a show too. And what do you mean? And I told him the details were already done. I had a venue, I had a date, and they didn't have those things yet. And he wasn't too happy about that. But so I did it was the third show that I did by myself at the Music Mart.
And then it was just
Fourth.
you from there on out?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
When did it start resembling what it looks like now? Right about that third show, or?
Yeah, the next year we came to Kane County, and it was kind of a barn, and then it just kept getting a little bit bigger. Barrett Deems used to come, and whenever he came in, people would want him to play, and they'd set up a drum set for him, and people'd gather around. And when he died, I thought, that was a nice touch. Maybe we should have somebody in, and then that was the beginning of the clinic program. The symbol book. I know the Rogers book and well, probably all of them need updating. The Rogers is probably the one that needs it the most. But I can't spend my remaining years rewriting the same books and expanding them. But the symbol book I want to get out, and I have a preliminary a draft of it because I'd done so much work on it that I wanted to show something last year. So I have a draft out that is printed up of what I want to do. But I think it's really important to straighten out the Zildjian narrative, which has become a victim of American marketing. And that's not. I don't have a problem with Zildjian and no hard feelings or anything, but the real Zildjian narrative kind of leaves out the whole K story and how they developed. And if you listen to strictly the American A Zildjian narrative, it leaves you with a lot of questions like, well, what about the other? So I think I've got a good handle on that. It's really confusing. There are a lot of narratives out there already with John Cohen's great book, and John Aldridge has done some writing on it, and Pars Tuglaci, the Turkish guy, and this book lists all of those, so people can go to those sources and try to decide for themselves. It's hard to access the Turkish archives unless you're Turkish, and Dr. Tuglaci was wonderful in that, except there's a lot of stories about him we'll do in another interview. But I think and I'm going to credit all those and tell what the ISBNs are and how to get them and stuff. Most of them are out of print, unfortunately, but anybody that's ambitious can find a copy and sort it out. But I think I've got a pretty good handle on what happened. A lot of facts came to light during the litigation between Zildjian and Gretsch over the years, and for quite a long time, Fred Gretsch was after me to do a symbol book, and he told me he thought it should be called Symbol Wars because of all the backbiting and litigation and everything. And I thought, yeah, I know Craigie. I was good friends with Bob and Armand. It's a good way to make everybody in the symbol world hate me to do a book like that. But most of those people are gone now. Craigie's obviously still around, but I wasn't aware until I really started digging how much litigation there was right from the get-go, from 1929 forward. And Gretsch owned the Zildjian trademark, had registered the trademarks in this country, and they came after Zildjian when they started in 1929. If you read the official Zildjian Company narrative, and they won. Gretsch won, and Zildjian USA was not allowed to use the name unless they said Avidus Zildjian made in USA to distinguish them from the trademarks that Gretsch owned. And they tried for years, and there's the litigation back and forth. And eventually they were able to get some of the names back, like A. Zildjian. The A. Zildjian trademark that Gretsch owned was not Avidus. That was from Aram, who had moved to Bucharest and started A. Zildjian. And so for a while, Gretsch had a deal with both Aram for his A. Zildjians and with the K. Zildjian people in Istanbul. And a lot of stuff about Aram came to light during the litigation in the 50s when Mikhail Zildjian, who had, I can't remember his original Turkish name, but he had married into the family and changed his name to Zilkan and then to Zildjian. And he was brought to the United States to be deposed and to testify. And he gave a lot of really interesting testimony about the process and when he learned it and who already had it and who he passed it on to and so on. So it's been a lot of fun trying to clarify that and
to weed through all that. Yeah. Wow. About how far along is the book?
I'm just about done with that section, and it's hard to say because I just haven't been working on it that much. I'd hope to have it here for this year and maybe next year, but it's unsure at this point. Yeah.
Awesome. Rob, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for listening.